Thank you very much. It's a full room. 1 million people. The largest book fair on planet Earth. Now, the next time I see somebody who tells me that people don't read anymore, I will tell them to come to the Hong Kong Book Fair. It's amazing. People read more and more in very different formats. Of course, there's another reason why. I hear a slight feedback there in the microphone. There's another reason why Hong Kong is such a massive event. I think it has to do with the fact in that in that enormous territory called the People's Republic, this happens to be the only place where one can speak freely, write freely, and read freely. As you can see, I like freedom, in particular my own, so I will walk around rather than stay here on the stage and tell you a little bit about China from 1945 to 1957. Where do I start my story? Well, around about 2008, I was digging in the archives, working on a book on Mao's Great Famine from 58 to 62. And I came across a really interesting little newspaper article. It was about construction workers in the city of Changchun. Changchun is all the way up north in Manchuria, north of Beijing. It gets very, very cold. They made a ghastly discovery. Below a meter of that rich black Manchurian soil were thousands of skeletons very tightly packed together. Residents gathered around the excavated area and wondered, could these be the victims of the Japanese occupation of Changchun during World War II? Apparently, only one elderly man realized that they had just stumbled upon the remnants of the Civil War. In 1948, Lin Biao, commander-in-chief, had laid siege to Changchun for 5 full months, trying to starve out a nationalist garrison stationed inside the city walls. Well, victory came at a heavy cost. At least 160,000 ordinary people also died of hunger during the blockade. After liberation, these bodies were unceremoniously dumped into mass graves without as much as a simple headstone. After decades of propaganda about the peaceful liberation of China, few people today know the cost of liberation and the conquest of China by the Communist Party. Where should we start? Well, I did a little bit of digging myself in the archives, and I found a whole bunch of archives on that first decade of communism. Secret police reports, investigations into uprisings in the countryside, uncorrected minutes of meetings by top leaders. That massive evidence points towards one conclusion, which I will give you now rather than wait till the end of my talk. Namely, that at the very heart of the Chinese Revolution is not so much a moral mandate or popular support, but broken promises, systematic violence, and calculated terror. Let me go back a little bit and mention Changchun, but our story really starts in 1945. On the 6th of August, Hiroshima is erased in a blinding flash of light. 2 days later, Stalin invades all of Manchuria. He could do so because he had received hundreds of shiploads of Lend-Lease material from the Americans. So much material that even in the rush to occupy Berlin, and half of Europe before the Americans, the Soviets managed to keep an army almost 1 million men strong in Siberia. They occupied Manchuria within days. They didn't leave, even after Japan capitulated. They stayed on for months on end, handed over the countryside to Mao Zedong and the communists, established 16 military institutions, including aircraft, artillery, and engineering schools. Some officers from Mao Zedong's army went to Moscow for advanced training. And all along, logistical help arrived across the border by sea or by train. From North Korea alone, a full 2,000 wagon loads were allocated to the task. While the Soviets were turning Mao Zedong's ragtag army of guerrilla fighters into a formidable fighting machine, the Americans, on the other hand, became so disillusioned with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists that they stopped deliveries of armaments. In September 1946, Truman imposed an arms embargo. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalists, rightly or wrongly, believed that he could not really defend China without control of Manchuria, the economic powerhouse and strategic gateway of the country. He kept on pouring his very best troops into Manchuria. But Mao Zedong was determined to wear down his enemy in a pitiless war of attrition, regardless of the human cost. By 1947, Manchuria had become a death trap. In April 1948, Lin Biao approached Changchun. Seeing that the garrison inside wouldn't surrender, he gave the order to turn Changchun into a city of death. 把Changchun 变成死城. Turn Changchun into a city of death. He established a perimeter around Changchun, sentries every 50 meters along barbed wire, trenches 4 meters deep. Zhang Zhenglong, a lieutenant with the People's Liberation Army, documented the siege in great detail. He came to a striking conclusion. He said Changchun was just like Hiroshima. Hiroshima took 9 seconds. Changchun took 5 months. The number of casualties was almost the same. Once Changchun fell, other cities were besieged. Beijing, unwilling to undergo the same fate, surrendered. One by one, cities fell like dominoes. Unwilling or incapable of fighting that Soviet-backed conquest of their own country. By the end of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, never to return. So, what was liberation? What happened once the red flag went up above the Forbidden City? Well, in every major city, liberation was celebrated with fanfare and a very carefully choreographed procession. Soldiers would inevitably open the parade, followed by a lorry with a large portrait of Mao Zedong. Dancers would wave big red flags, swinging their bodies to the music played by waist drums, heavy gongs and trumpets. Many people were quite happy. This, at least, seemed to be the start of an era of peace and hopefully prosperity. Others were more guarded. But soon after the celebrations, the police did the rounds. They were less friendly. They were there to invite themselves into people's homes and ferret out forbidden items ranging from radios to weapons. The police often were just government servants. In 1949, the new regime was faced with the task of running an enormous country. So in the police headquarters, City Hall, the post office, the communists asked government employees to stay on and help the new regime in exchange for a promise of protection. The police did the rounds with a few cadres, and they did more than just find hidden weapons. They started assigning a class label, a 成分, to every single person. There were good classes for revolutionary soldiers, poor workers, and so-called poor peasants. Intellectuals belonged to middle classes, and there were bad classes, to which were consigned people alleged to be landlords, alleged to be capitalists. Very soon, these class designations were simplified into a simple opposite: red and black, friend and foe. Regardless, all of them had to go back to school. From Beijing all the way down south to Guangzhou, cities became giant adult education centers as people were asked to learn the new orthodoxy and to transform themselves into what the communists called new people, 新民. Of course, not all of them were so lucky. At the very bottom of the social scale were people seen to be a drain on public resources and a threat to social stability. Paupers, pickpockets, prostitutes, but of course also millions of refugees and disbanded soldiers. In batch after batch, they were sent away to the countryside, which became the great dumping ground for all undesirable elements. They were not the only ones to leave cities. Foreigners left in droves as the bamboo curtain came down. Shanghai, just before liberation, was a city half again as big as Moscow, with a larger foreign population than any city on planet Earth except New York. More foreign investment than either London or Paris. Within months, bustling Shanghai was a dying city. Shops were shuttered at 6 in the evening. A curfew was imposed. Dance halls were closed down. Nightclubs converted into factories. Unemployment rocketed. A similar scenario happened in Tianjin and in Guangzhou. So far, I've spoken about cities. But how about the countryside, where the majority of people, after all, lived at the time? Well, liberation was followed by something referred to as land reform, 土改. I call it so-called land reform because it had more to do with politics than with the distribution of land. Land reform started in 1947, all the way up in those parts of Manchuria controlled by the communists, and it was over roughly by 1950, sometimes a little bit later. What was land reform? Let us focus on one small village called Yuanbaozhen, which is north of Changchun in Manchuria. In 1947, a work team arrived. The work team started looking at the power structure inside the village. But they did more than that. They started interfering. They started fanning up resentment, digging up local grudges, turning grievances into something much bigger called class hatred. Of course, there were poor people who had genuine frustrations that had long been bottled up. Others were coerced into making accusations against their neighbors who were hardly better off. The landlord, Diju, of Yuanbao, was a man who lived in a mud hut like everybody else, except that he had one glass window about this size. It's a sign of his wealth. Bit by bit, a closely knit community was polarized into extremes. A majority of those who somehow went along, and a very small number of carefully targeted people, referred to by the communists as tyrants, traitors, landlords. After a couple of months, they were arrested, dragged into a cowshed, one by one, taken out onto a stage not unlike this one. They were confronted by hundreds of villagers who cried for their blood, who wanted to settle accounts. Of course, nobody in that village could refuse to take place in what were referred to as struggle meetings. To stand on the sidelines was running the risk of being accused of being a landlord oneself. 保庇地主, protecting a landlord. Everybody had to participate, whether they liked it or not. In that village of 700 people, 73 died. Not all of them were beaten to death. A couple tried to hide in the fields where they froze to death. Manchuria can be pretty darn cold in the middle of the winter. The assets and land of the victims were distributed to everybody according to a very strict picking order. The poor always on top of the list. The land was paced, measured, distributed. Assets of these victims distributed as well. Grain loaded into baskets. Pigs driven along. Furniture lugged away. It looked like moving day. In short, everybody in that village had been forced to participate in the ritual killing of a number of elites, a number of village leaders. All of them had blood on their hands. Or to put it slightly differently, Mao Zedong wanted to make sure that everybody in each village was tied to the party in a pact sealed in blood. A sufficient quantity of blood had to be shed in order for a return to the past to become impossible. Once people were implicated in the murder of these targets, they themselves hoped that the old regime would not come back. Yuanbao was violent, but land reform was violent in many other places. In Hebei, Liu Shaoqi, number 2 in the party hierarchy, reported how some people were hung from trees and dismembered. Others were buried alive. Sometimes the children of people denounced as landlords were persecuted as little landlords. How many? Well, by all accounts, by the end of land reform, about 10 million people were expropriated. 40% of the land changed hands. It's impossible to know how many people died violently, but a number of estimates place it at between 1.5 to 2 million people. Countless others were stigmatized as class enemies and exploiters. Now we are at the end of land reform. Could the country finally heave a sigh and look forward to peace and stability? Not quite. Barely 1 year after Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China. Barely a year later, on the 18th of October 1950, some 200,000 troops crossed the border into North Korea and attack United Nations troops a week later. Mao has thrown his country into the Korean War and uses it to clamp down on any form of opposition inside the People's Republic. Already a week earlier, on the 10th of October, which some of you will recognize as National Day, celebrated by the nationalists, he had issued a directive demanding that all remnant nationalist troops, bandits, secret agents, and other counter-revolutionaries be liquidated. Now, you might think by 1950, surely there can't be all that many opponents left after a grueling land reform. Of course, the regime lived already at this stage in fear of its own shadow. There was paranoia everywhere. When a well was poisoned or a granary went up in flames, the regime detected the hand of a spy or a landlord. But the beauty of the archives is that they demonstrate very clearly that already in 1949 and 1950, the regime was faced with massive opposition, in particular in much of the South. In one county alone, near Dongting Lake, some 10,000 irate villagers surrounded the party headquarters. In Hubei, assaults on granaries were described in the secret report as ceaseless. In East China, Shandong mainly, 40 rebellions within the 3 first months of 1950 alone. In parts of Guangxi, all the way in the south, in some villages, 1 in 3 able men took to the mountains to join the guerrilla fighters who were opposed to the Communist Party. So there was real opposition here. But how could Mao and the regime decide how many people should be killed in what was a campaign of terror? Luo Ruiqing, a minister of public security, could hardly oversee the arrest and trial of the many, many millions who became the target of this campaign. So, like grain output or industrial production, death came with a quota mandated from above. Mao thought that the quota should be 1 per 1,000. Kill 1 per 1,000. In every village, in every town, make sure that 1 per 1,000 is shot in public. It seems rather low, but before you know it, this quota went up. After all, there were plenty of assiduous underlings, willing executioners, trying to show how revolutionary they were by fulfilling and over-fulfilling the quota. And then, of course, in this fractured society, terror was also driven from below by people trying to seek revenge or right personal wrongs in the name of revolution. So already by the end of 1950, when this campaign has barely started, entire provinces like Guizhou ask for this quota to be trebled to 3 per 1,000. Who are the victims? Well, if you have to kill a certain number of people, there are bound to be innocent bystanders. Let me give you one example. It comes from a county called Yanxing in Yunnan, rich, covered in salt fields, and there in April 1951, a good 100 students are arrested after an anonymous denunciation reaches the party headquarters. Wu Lianning is aged 10. He is hung from a beam and beaten. Ma Silie is aged 8. He is forced to kneel on a concrete floor and his legs are shattered. 2 of these school children are tortured to death. Now, I can hear very vaguely in the distance an objection. You might think, oh, well, surely that's an exceptional example. Surely that only happened once or twice. But again, you do not need to spend a lot of time in archives to find other examples. Take the county of Luoding, much closer to us here at home, across the border in Guangdong province. Same month, April 1951, 340 children are arrested on the basis of one suspected case of theft in all of Guangdong, Guangdong province. In all of Guangdong, 1/3 of the victims of this campaign of terror are judged to be innocent by the very standards of the party itself at the time. But something else is happening. Something else is happening. These executions are supposed to reflect the wrath of the people. Victims are paraded, condemned by a people's tribunal, shot in public. But something much more insidious happens. All over the country, local cadres carry out their own personal vendettas against the local population. In Maogong and Sichuan, 10 people are judged to be counter-revolutionaries, paraded through town, shot in the head. Another 170 people are covertly arrested, secretly assassinated. Whole villages are razed to the ground without any local cadre ever reporting this to their superiors. Everywhere, people die away from the public eye, deep inside the forest, near ravines, along rivers, alone or in batches. How many? By the time the campaign is over, the end of 1952, it will have lasted for 1 full year, Luo Reiqing, the minister I mentioned earlier on, reports to Mao that in a mere 6 provinces, some 301,800 people have been publicly executed. Bo Yibo, Minister of Finances at the time, puts the number at 2 million in 1952. 2 million victims. You might think it's over, but Mao at this stage, by the end of 1951, has decided to shift his attention towards the ranks of the party itself. He sees corruption. The high point of the campaign comes on a cold, wintry day when 2 top officials in Hubei are executed. They are shot in the heart, not in the head, as a concession to their status as senior party members. It causes ripples throughout the party. Bo Yibo, who I just mentioned, papa of one Wu Xilai, reveals to the chairman that there are at least 10,000 cases of corruption in the upper echelons of the party. Xi Zhongxun, papa of one Xi Jinping, reports that in the entire Northwest, there are about 1/3 of cases of corruption inside the party and the government. But underneath this campaign, with a number of highly publicized cases of party corruption, something more sinister is happening. Remember those people in the post office, in the police headquarters, government employees who were asked to stay on in 1949. Well, they are no longer required. New cadres have been trained. About 1 million of them are very quietly dismissed, some of them sent off to the Gulag. Of course, this is not quite the end of it either. Even as this campaign against corruption inside the party ranks is unfolding, Mao believes that the corruption is caused by outsiders. He calls these the bourgeoisie, which has been using sugar bullets to corrupt the party. He declares on the 5th of January 1952 that the bourgeoisie has been waging a savage offensive against the party. It's quite striking. How could you possibly do that? Nonetheless, he declares war on the bourgeoisie, which is a term he uses to describe the private sector, from small little shopkeepers to major industrialists. These people are now dragged onto a stage not dissimilar to this one, and the same techniques fine-tuned during land reform are now used in cities as they have to confront the workers of factories and shops. Again, it's difficult to point out how many victims there were, but in Shanghai alone, within a period of 2 months, according to the party records, 644 people commit suicide. 644 people. Not that it's easy to commit suicide, because, of course, all these suspects are under very close surveillance. For those who manage to make their way to the top of a skyscraper, even jumping off the building isn't that easy, since the police has erected nets that jut out from the first floor. So these candidates for death have to take jumping runs, make sure they jump over those nets and land on the street. This is the end of 1952, and we still have 5 years to cover. I would like to do that very briefly in another 5, 6, 7 minutes by referring to 2 major events, both of them triggered by Moscow. The first one you probably know already. It takes place in March 1953. March 1953, Stalin dies. The man who helped Mao conquer power disappears. He was the only one to somehow have the power to restrain Mao. In 1949, Stalin urged Mao to not be too rough on rich peasants, and Stalin knew something about it. In 1952, Stalin urged Mao to not be too fast in collectivizing the economy. Well, as soon as the old man was dead, Mao had a free hand. By the end of 1953, a monopoly on the grain was imposed on the countryside, meaning that farmers had to sell the grain that they produced to the state at state-mandated prices, in state-determined quantities, and in state-run shops. In other words, they lost their freedom and control over the harvest. It created famine in 1954, and a traditional response to famine for villagers is to leave the village and seek work in the cities. This did not go down very well with the regime, who wanted the farmers to produce grain for the state. So in the summer of 1955, Zhou Enlai imposed the hukou system, a household registration system equivalent to the Soviet internal passport, which literally tied villagers to the land. They couldn't leave anymore. The same year, 1955, massive state farms were introduced on the model of the Soviet Union. The land was taken back, now belonged to the state. By 1956, many, but not all villages, had lost their freedom of movement, their control over the harvest, their right to own land, and in fact, even control over their own daily schedule. There were local cadres who told them who should do what, for how many work points. They were bonded servants of the state. In the cities too, industry and commerce became functions of the state as all private enterprises were nationalized, from your small little shop to much larger factories. Popular unrest and dissatisfaction was extreme in 1956. How do we know this? Because of another event, again triggered by Moscow. This one took place in February 1956, when Khrushchev, who had taken over from Stalin, denounced his erstwhile master, Stalin, for having presided over an era of terror and fear. Khrushchev denounced the deportations, the executions, and also savaged the state farms that Stalin had introduced in the late 1920s. Mao was not pleased. He took it as a personal attack. He, after all, was the new Stalin, and certainly the Stalin of China. Zhou Enlai and others used de-Stalinization, the secret report by Khrushchev, to slow down the pace of collectivization. Mao took 2 months to think about how he should respond to de-Stalinization and an attack on the very man on which he had modeled his own life. On the 25th of April, exactly 2 months after Khrushchev's secret report, he gave a speech which I will not summarize for you, but it was entitled On the 10 Great Relationships. It was a masterful speech. In order to reclaim moral authority over the party, Mao championed the ordinary man. Mao became a protector of human rights. 2 months earlier, he had looked like an aging dictator, out of touch with reality, clinging on to a model that had failed in the past. And now he, rather than Khrushchev, looked like the more liberal voice in the communist camp. Mao demanded freedom of expression for intellectuals. A week later, he asked the party to accept that 100 flowers bloom, 100 schools contend. And content people did throughout 1956. In a small city like Xi'an, not far away from where the terracotta warriors are buried, some 40 cases of workers going on strike, students petitioning the government. In Wuhan, several party leaders were physically attacked by students and paraded through the streets. In Fuzhou, just opposite Taiwan, 60 cases of workers going on strike. Farmers across the border here from Hong Kong, in parts of Guangdong, left these state farms in droves, claimed their own land back, took their animals, decided to go it alone. It looked like open rebellion. Yet, intellectuals refrained from speaking out. Mao urged them on in February 1957. Finally, they too started to speak out. Mao didn't like what he heard. Some intellectuals demanded that the Communist Party step down. Others clamored for human rights and democracy. A few compared Mao to the Pope. That must have hurt. Taken aback by this torrent of criticism, Mao changed course. He turned around and called all those intellectuals and students who were critical rightists, in other words, counter-revolutionaries. He put a small man called Deng Xiaoping in charge of a ferocious campaign during which 500,000 people were labeled as rightists, many of them sent off to the Gulag. Here we are, by the end of 1957. Pretty much every single promise that Mao had made had been broken. Mao, like Lenin and the Bolsheviks, much earlier, had promised every disaffected group what they wanted most: land for poor peasants, better working conditions for the workers, independence for minorities, freedom of expression for intellectuals, protection of private property for private entrepreneurs. All of these promises had been broken. By the end of 1957, any kind of opposition to the party had been crushed. By the end of 1957, Mao was ready for a whole new experiment in communism. That experiment was called The Great Leap Forward, and it's the story for another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for the inspiring sharing. May we now invite Mr. Tao to come to the stage to join Frank for the next discussion part. Maybe we have to wait for a minute. Anything, Frank, you want to share with us?
I spoke for exactly 14 minutes. I wouldn't want to bore you even more.
Just went to the toilet.
Okay.
Let's give a big hand to Mr. Tao.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you for your very condensed chronology of modern China, given within 40 minutes. This is the best lecture of national education I've ever heard.
Thank you.
I wish the education secretary would be here among the audience so that he would know national education is not that undesirable or unwelcome curriculum to be introduced to Hong Kong, provided that the teacher is someone like Frank.
I'd be
as frank as
delighted
possible
to offer my services.
Right. So, we've heard a lot about your previous book, The Great Famine. The figure you have cited, 45 million deaths within the short period of the great leap forward, is just unimaginable to many Westerners who would just express a degree of disbelief. How on earth could that be possible? So, in order to understand all these episodes dating from 1945 to 1957, I think, in my humble opinion, the key is to the understanding of a great and complex personality, Chairman Mao. So, and for most Western readers, Chairman Mao is a mystical figure. If you compare Mao with Hitler, they could understand Hitler, because Hitler has been straightforward and consistent, at least from the start to the end. as a teenager or as a retired First World War soldier, he had been believing strongly in the supremacy of the Germanic people. He has been hating some terms of the Versailles treaties, and he had wanted to exterminate all the Jewish people. And these ideas and notions or creeds have been clearly expressed in his earlier autobiography, Mein Kampf. But Mao had been a very mystical figure. In 1945, when he received many American journalists and sinologists were enchanted by a Mao who told them, who strongly believed in American democracy, in parliamentary democracy. And we had a Mao who told Western reporters that all he was interested was something like a coalition government. And Washington, rather than Lenin, was his icon. And in 1949, up to 1949, many Western intellectuals, or even Washington, believed, if not suspected, that Mao was launching a just civil war. And Chiang Kai-shek's government represented corruption, backwardness, despotism, or even a tyranny. And then Mao, after he gained his power, and we also saw a sudden shift, and then he launched the Korean War, right? Yep. And that huge change of positions, or some basic beliefs, somewhat was a bit of a shock, for a normal mindset to accept. And what do you think? Now, if you simply condemn that kind of deception as a human evil, I would say Mao's evil is not just common. It's a biblical evil that unseen, I think, in the history of mankind. What do you think about the personality of Chairman Mao himself?
I never met the man, so...
You could gather his conversation with someone like Edgar Snow and others.
Yeah, it's difficult to say in the sense that even if I had met him, of course Mao, like the regime in its entirety, has a split personality. There is what it projects to the outside world, an image of democracy, freedom, equality, justice, the proclaimed ideals of communism. And an inner reality, which I would describe as pitiless. I use the term pitiless to describe the siege of Changchun by Lin Biao. But to be pitiless is very much at the heart of communism, not just in China, but also, of course, in the Soviet Union. Stalin is called Stalin. Stalin means steel. His closest henchman is Molotov. Molotov means hammer. Why? Because you must be a man of steel and you must be able to hammer your way through to revolution. You're not going to sit back and cry and feel sorry for people because they die, because they starve to death. This vision must be pursued at all cost. And that, to me, is one of the great contrasts and the difficulties one deals with when looking at communist regimes. Again, the propaganda is wonderful, like the one in Nazi Germany, of course. They look very similar. Wonderful young people, strong bodies, looking towards the future, and the reality, which is sheer misery. That contrast is played out by individuals. Zhou Enlai is probably one of the greatest actors on that huge theater that is the People's Republic, able to charm almost everybody he speaks to. And so is Mao. People who walk away, Mitterrand in 1962, right bang in the middle of the worst famine of the 20th century. Mitterrand, who later becomes president of France, flies in, is charmed by Mao, flies back, to say there's no such thing as a famine in China. There may be shortages. So it's that split personality both in Mao but also in communism in general. But of course, something else you alluded to, the willingness of outsiders and some insiders to believe in the propaganda, to believe with what is said rather than with what is done, to embrace the ideal at the expense of the reality.
So, and then in 1955, there was this notorious or most infamous anti-rightist campaign, right? So, I mean, you could explain the famine as a failure of Mao's early passionate ideology. Yes, that famine could be forgivable or excusable because Mao, as most Western liberal intellectuals used to believe, was very eager to build up a communist utopia. But that hatred against intellectuals, especially writers, historians, musicians, painters, in the field of humanities, so that Mao would just design deliberately with the most cynical calculations, a trap for all these intellectuals to fall in by appealing to them to speak up their mind, to criticize the government. And then after a few months, you fall into the trap. And then they all got exterminated. But that psyche of deception has never been seen. I mean, Hitler wouldn't do that. And I haven't seen, we haven't seen Stalin. Even Stalin would not do that. That deliberate calculation of deception, even for the purpose, almost for the purpose of some kind of pleasure. It's not just mischief, but malice. It's a kind of twisted, perverted pleasure. And this is what made Mao such an inexplicable figure, and also beyond the belief of of an average Western intellectual.
Yeah, I think Stalin and certainly Hitler could be pretty cold and calculating too, and did some pretty awful things. Holocaust is one of them. But to me, the key difference between good old Stalin and the good old chairman is that Mao, from the very beginning, and it starts with so-called land reform, wants people to denounce each other. In your village, you get villagers denounce other villages. In the Soviet Union, Stalin gets the police to pretty much liquidate those designated as rich farmers. And then during the anti-rightist campaign, again, Mao wants intellectuals to denounce each other. Some of them do so with relish. During the campaign against private enterprises in 1952, which I mentioned earlier on, again, the same story. Some of these entrepreneurs are driven by sheer terror, start denouncing each other. That people must be implicated in the demise of others. And of course, that whole framework in which people denounce others by choice, by necessity, becomes the very core of the Cultural Revolution later on. But that, to me, is the key distinction between Stalin and Mao.
Well, my final question before inviting the audience to raise their hands for question is that, well, Mao died in 1976. Do you agree that Mao's influence still remains? You mentioned a great number of willing collaborators from common Chinese people. Now, I mean, in Hong Kong, we see so many willing collaborators with Beijing, or in explaining what the basic law from a very fresh start, in promoting the white paper or whatever. I mean, these people, they either have business interests in China, or for a long time they have, I don't know, been subject to a kind of indoctrination that China, well, maybe it has made a lot of awful mistakes in the past, but it is different now, right? If you call that a common mentality of willing collaboration, why does it exist among the Chinese people? I wouldn't say uniquely, but so massively and for so long. I mean, okay, in the Nazi Germany, yes, you had the White Roses Society among some young intellectuals who found Hitler, who thought Hitler was a mistake. Yes, perhaps these young intellectuals in the University of Munich were exposed or informed by their own colleagues, to the Nazi government. But it only existed in a very short period. The German people don't do that anymore. And why does that mentality is so deep-rooted in a nation with a civilization they boast for more than 3,000 years?
I think it's a human phenomenon. I was born in Holland, but I left when I was 12 with my family, so I don't really speak Dutch at all. But one day a crew turned up from Dutch TV that said, we would like to interview you about the celebrations around the death of Mao Zedong. I said, well, I don't speak any Dutch. Why don't you pick a Dutch person? They said, well, you're the only one who was willing to say something critical about the People's Republic. So I'm sure it's not the same for the Netherlands. For a fact, I know that there are plenty of people who refer to themselves as sinologists who will pretty much fashion their careers around avoiding saying anything critical of the People's Republic. But the key word when it comes to Hong Kong must be united front. This is the one key term you must remember, united front, 统战. It is a technique that is applied to Eastern Europe by Stalin after the end of the Second World War. Stalin has invaded half of Europe, and now he must pretend that that half of Europe, Eastern Europe, actually voluntarily wishes to become communist. Plane loads fly in of Poles, of Czechs, of Hungarians, of East Germans trained in Moscow to take over and use the techniques of the United Front to create an image of willingness where others outside of the party are somehow voluntarily included. This United Front is also applied by the communists after 1949 to create the illusion of a majority, to make promises to those outside of the party, promise protection of property to business people, promise independence to minorities. Make any promise you can in order to include as many as you can. Mao put it in a nutshell. Rally the majority and pick out your enemies one by one. That's what he did after 1949. Of course, there is still a united front to this day. In that sense, we are still seeing the unfolding of history after the Second World War. Forget the liaison office, if I may say this term, without being handcuffed. Focus on united front.
So, Frank, this book you have just published, I would say, is not the kind of book Henry Kissinger would recommend many American businessmen to read, I suppose, right?
Well, I'm sure he wouldn't recommend my work, and I'm happy to say that I wouldn't recommend his either. And there's a very long review by me in the Sunday Times in England, a review of his book called China. It's not very positive. Of course, Henry Kissinger has a massive enterprise in the People's Republic.
You see, this is a mystical character to me. This is the same Henry Kissinger who designed the sternest anti-communist global strategy with a right-wing politician named Richard Nixon. And this is the same Henry Kissinger who recommended the bombing of Cambodia and the most ruthless massacre of the Viet Cong towards the end of the 1960s or the early of 1970s. This is the same crafty and shrewd Henry Kissinger who would just play with his mastery of the English language by laying the trap on the issue of Taiwan in the so-called Shanghai Communique together with Richard Nixon, so that China had been fooled for more than 20 years that Taiwan, that the US was in fact secretly sympathetic with a more independent Taiwan and preventing the communist China from devouring that island with a few very cleverly designed words in the Shanghai Communique. Well, yet this is the same Henry Kissinger now, who is almost acting like a Gobel, for China. We all know that he's on some sort of payroll, but at least, he shouldn't be that, he couldn't be that blatant, could he?
No, I think it's not just protecting his own business interests. I think that there are somehow individuals in Europe and the United States and Australia who somehow, when they hear the word China, just switch off the critical faculty.
So, it is the kind of vulnerabilities and weaknesses, I would say, universally in human nature, rather than among the Chinese.
I think so.
If you want to find the key to this mystical, massive, hypnotizing, of the Chinese people during the 1940s, especially intellectuals in Shanghai, and then perhaps the answers lie in the West now, because I sometimes encounter some veteran Chinese intellectuals. I ask them, now Mao and his army and his party committed mass great crimes even before 1949, massacring about 30,000 communist, I don't know, their own people in Jinggangshan in 1929. And then massacring intellectuals in Yan'an in the 1940s. There were certainly bodies and skeletons left behind. And then in China during the 1920s and 30s, there was relatively quite a free press. Yet no reporters went to the occupied areas occupied by the communists, and then managed to dig out all these facts and news stories and reported them. So that within a span of 20 years, intellectuals in Shanghai still believed that Mao offered an utopian alternative for the future of China. This is absolutely amazing. For those intellectuals like A.J.P. Taylor, historian in the UK, even Bertrand Russell, who had never been to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. They had not seen the People's Commune, the collectivism under Stalin, and the famine generated by them. They blindly believed in the Soviet model as a better one compared with the rotten capitalism of America and Britain. Fine. But during the 1920s and 30s, China was an extensive country. Certainly there were travelers, there were journalists, and yet Mao managed to hide all these skeletons into a tiny box. And so that the whole world, not only China, the whole world was duped into believing that a brighter utopia was about to come, and which it did in 1949. This is a big mystery.
Allow me to shamelessly promote a little book I wrote, and it's called The Age of Openness, and it's about China in the 1920s and 30s. And it talks about the openness and governance in the movement of people, in freedom of expression relative to other countries that marked that entire period until the advent of the Second World War. I think maybe we should have some questions from the audience.
Yes, that's that lady there, yes.
Hi, so I'm with the SCMP. I was wondering if you could say, if there was one message that Hong Kongers could take away from your most recent book, what would it be?
United front.
Could you extrapolate a bit more on that?
Yes, but I just did. I would say that all too often we forget that the very mechanism of the United Front has a very long and well-tested history. This is not just some set of tools that came about recently. It's something that has been fine-tuned since the end of the Second World War, first in Eastern Europe and then in other countries. And it is insidious in the sense that it makes a lot of promises and wishes to include as many as possible, yet ultimately ends up by deceiving all those who somehow went along with that message of a united front. So that, to me, is the key term.
When you meet a Chinese official, a Chinese businessman, and then engage with him on a friendly conversation, if a conversation starts something like this, it has taken America 200 years to build up a sophisticated democracy. And we are a civilization of 2,000 years, and we have been engaged on reform for only 20 years. Don't you think it needs a bit of more time for China to do things step by step? Number one. Okay? You accuse, including Professor Dikötter, of Mao massacring so many people and leaving tens of millions of people to death in famine, right? And then, yes, we did make some mistakes. We did make some mistakes. But don't you think you Dutch have massacred many people, native people in Indonesia and East Timor? And then think, why did you never mention the imperial legacy, the legacy of Western imperialism, invasion of China in your book, so that a more balanced view is given? If the West, and in particular, the white people, have massacred so many red Indians, black people in Africa, and in native Indonesian, what on earth what right do you have to, in criticizing a few mistakes made by our great national leaders like Chairman Mao and Pol Pot? If a conversation starts something like that, you know the mechanism of United Front is working. The United Front campaign is not just PR. It's not a normal kind of propaganda warfare, as you understand from some textbooks in the courses of international politics in Yale University. It is a very sophisticated system of combining history, sociology, and making use of cultural barriers, and also working scientifically on human weaknesses like gullibility and some blind spots. And it's a huge topic. And I'd like Frank to work on that topic as your next book. All right? Any more questions? Yes, that gentleman there.
Mr. Dikötter, I totally agree what you have written on your book, because it is also part of my family history in my previous generation. Now I have two questions. The first one is that, do you think you will still allowed to enter China again after publishing so many books about the Chinese history? And the second question is that, is my hypothesis. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to go into China again and was detained at the immigration and accusing you like spreading evil messages to belittle the superpower. And as a foreigner, you just know nothing about the matter of the countrymen in China and also their mentality, and as well as guoqing. And do you think you would regret by publishing so many books about the modern Chinese history?
Well,
Thank you.
what exactly is the alternative? So I decided, 30 years ago to become a historian, and I picked modern China. And then what? I'm going to spend my career somehow very carefully walking around those massive, big black holes in the history of China that somehow swallowed up the lives of tens of millions of people and pretend it didn't happen? Or just stop at the border, 1949? I will not write about anything that happened after 1949. That's not really a viable position. Or should I live in fear, like so many of my so-called Scientological colleagues will make sure not to offend anything or anybody when it comes to the People's Republic? When I researched Mao's Great Famine in 2006, from 2006 onwards, people told me I would never be able to go back. Mao's Great Famine was published in 2010. It got the Samuel Johnson Award a year later. People came up and said, now you will never be allowed back in. Well, I went back in, went to archives, a good dozen of them, to research the tragedy of liberation. When that book came out, people told me, ooh, you will never be allowed back in. I went back in to a good dozen provincial archives to research the final installment of this trilogy, which will take the reader through the Cultural Revolution all the way up till 1976. I found a lot of material. I was in the archives only 3 months ago. So far, nobody has stopped me. In fact, nobody's even invited me for tea, which I think is a little rude. So, what can I say? You know, I just do what I think I should be doing as a professional historian. Try to find as much material as you can, think about it, and try to write it up in an intelligible manner. That's what I've been doing. If for some reason I will not be allowed to go back to the People's Republic, well, I'd be very sad. I have many friends there. I've spent many years in the People's Republic in the 1980s. So clearly I'm very attached to the place, but that threat is not going to make me write in a different manner. I might start writing on Hong Kong, who knows?
Yes, yes, you first, please, yes.
Mr. Dikötter, how do you convince the government to allow you to enter the archives to, do the research? Because it seems like what you're doing is pretty much unfolding the shame that they did like 50 years ago. Thank you.
Yes, I get this question too. When Mao's Great Famine came out, ooh, how come you were allowed in those archives? At the time, I said these doors are not exactly wide open, but any professional historian with some credentials from a good university would be able to do similar research. In fact, I am hardly ever alone in any of those archives. There are always local historians there working on very touchy topics. So it's not just me. I'm no hero. I mean, I'm a coward. If there's any trouble, I'm out of there.
Well, his book doesn't contain any terms like Falun Gong, Xinjiang, Dalai Lama. I mean, all these terms are considered to be sensitive with the present, whereas I think Frank's research work deals with a lot about the past, Mao, and also, I think you were doing your research during Jiang Zemin's time, and Jiang was educated in the late 1940s, and personality-wise, he was not a Maoist himself. I mean, you could say he was a Chinese version of Pinochet, or I don't know what Mubarak or whatever. But he did not believe in Maoism, so he wouldn't mind, perhaps, during his reign, that someone like you to expose some past skeletons, which he considered he and his government had nothing to do with. Yeah. But I'm not sure whether you could do the same thing now under Xi Jinping, because he's now kidnapped or at least surrounded by very passionate Maoists,
Indeed.
Which has not been seen in the past 20 years.
It's become much more difficult, that's true. But the real heroes are those local historians I just referred to. For instance, Gao Wangling and Yu Xiguang and Qiao Peihua, 3 wonderful historians who've published on Mao's Great Famine. And of course, they have published here in Hong Kong because they can't publish in the People's Republic itself. But nonetheless, they've taken much greater risks with their careers than I have. Those are the people who I truly admire.
A native Chinese scholar would not be able to do that. If he wanted to dig out the same archive and wanted to write the book on the same scale as this one in Chinese, and if he's a Chinese resident, no. Because Beijing knows that it would have a lot of influence. But for someone like Frank, who does it in English, first, most Chinese people would not gain access. And second, even if this book is widely read in the West, there is a psychological good side effect, so that a frequent American businessman who travels to Beijing and Shanghai nowadays could know right away the stark contrast. Yes, more than 45 years ago, there was famine. But look at how the Chinese now live. They are able to buy Lafite, all the brand of red wine, Louis Vuitton or whatever. And this is the great achievement of the present communist government.
It's very true. It's very sad that the regime itself takes the credit.
So your book
for having pulled
works
those people out
in
of it.
their favor.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Any more questions?
In fact,
Yes.
I'm a spy of the People's Republic.
Frank, you've written a number of books on the Chinese modern history, but they are not allowed to be published in China. But even if you could publish those books, as far as I know, the Chinese nowadays, they don't really care about the history, the China a few decades ago. So actually, even in Hong Kong, look at the size of your department at the University of Hong Kong. How many students are there in your class? Is there any Chinese student coming from mainland China, in your class? Well, I guess you know the answer, but my question is, what would you like to say to the Chinese if you have opportunity to do so?
Well, the book, Mao's Great Famine, has been translated and published by Baopu at the New Century Press, Xin City 出版社, here in Hong Kong. And it's sold many thousands. And of course, it's a banned book, but you can buy it at the fair here today. You can smuggle it across. You can photocopy it. The one thing I would advise you not to do is to send it, because customs are quite tough. I've lost many copies myself sending it. Although there is a way in which you can do it. You have to take the book, you have to literally open it and break the back and make it look very flat, and then you write documents on the outside. That's the way to get it through.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Dikötter. My question is that the liberal studies subjects in Hong Kong require students to look at issues from the multiple perspectives and looking at both the pros and cons of the issues in a balanced manner. However, it seems that 2 books that you publish on the PRCs seems to be a fierce attack and criticism of the regimes. So if you have to give advice to history and liberal studies teachers in Hong Kong, to what feedback or advice would you give them? How can they teach students to look at the PRC history or the modern China's in a balanced and objective manner? Thank you.
Well, I think my books are very balanced and very objective. They're grounded in an awful lot of archival material, more than I think anybody's been able to drag out of those archives. And I think it's quite balanced in that I do give very different people a voice in there, including Chairman Mao himself. Having said that, there is, of course, something about the idea of balanced? I mean, when you approach the Holocaust, should you be balanced? I mean, what exactly does that mean? Should we point out that Germany in 1936 was an economic miracle, which it was? Should we point out that Hitler was elected in 1933? Should we have a balance? Hitler solved the unemployment problem, and he built wonderful highways. And, most importantly, say it again? Volkswagen. And the Volkswagen. And most importantly, he was kind to his dog. He was very kind to his dog. Now, the problem here is that you can't just pick and choose. It's not a menu. You can't say, oh, I have a little bit of that and a little bit of that, but I don't like that. It's an overall system. You can't just say solving the unemployment problem is good, invading all of Europe, causing the Second World War and a Holocaust is not too good. It's not a menu. It's a total package here. And most of all, it's important to look at precisely what the proclaimed aims of the regime were at the time, which was to move forwards towards an era of peace, justice, equity. Now, I don't think that any of those goals have really been reached in the 50s or the 60s. So when I hear the word balance, I'm always a little suspicious.
A historian presents facts. A historian doesn't attack. Bruce Lee attacks. I mean, if you present all these facts out of communist archives, right? And if you just juxtapose and present all these facts objectively and simply leave the reader to draw his own conclusion, I wouldn't think someone like Frank would qualify as an attacker, right? So, I mean...
The Sunday Times called me, for this book, dispassionate.
Which is good.
The Economist said, maybe it's just a little too objective, a little bit too factual.
Is that a compliment?
Well, I don't know.
Or a piece of
clearly
liberal cynicism?
Some readers say, I hate Mao, and then other readers say, oh, I'm dispassionate, I don't say enough. So yes. I guess I'm striking the right balance, possibly.
If you want a balance, just buy any English book on China publishing in Beijing, and then read the two texts and draw your own conclusion, right? That's what you call balance. What? Any more questions? What? You first, right? And then you next.
Hello. I'd just like to ask Mr. Dikötter what the Communist Party's goals are currently and whether they have changed since Mao's time in power.
Oh, I think that's a very easy question. I don't know. I'm a historian. I study the past, so I wouldn't know what. I wouldn't be able to comment on China today. Just imagine having to read through all this stuff from the 50s and the 60s, and then in the evening I sit down to read more policy documents on China now. It would drive me insane. So I honestly don't know. One more.
Hello, I am enjoying this discussion. I'm an American, and I haven't been in Hong Kong in a while, but there was this consideration of a split personality in countries and in great people. I think one of the things I've looked at in my own country, especially since post-World War II, is that although we are a paragon and we preach democracy and justice, if you look at our record militarily, I sometimes think that we're also a very split country, personality-wise. And I just thought it was interesting that the two examples that you picked to talk about that are Nazi Germany and Stalin. I'm coming to a frame of mind where I may start to include America as part of that, and yet America is quote-unquote democracy and quote-unquote the policeman of the world, or used to be. So I would have felt a lot more comfortable if we did not just make these comparisons with China with just two people agree are evil people, evil countries in many ways. And I'm just wondering what your reaction might be to that.
Well, that's an easy one too. That goes back to the point that Chip Tsao just made a while ago about the United Front. Rule number 1. Try to look at China positively. Try to compare it with democracies where things aren't all that hunky-dory.
But it's not a comparison with this democracy. It's the complexity of running any country that quite often we do have.
These are one-party states. The Leninist model appears in 1917. It's still running its course today. Now, I am aware of the fact that history in the United States isn't all that glorious. I do remember landing in Massachusetts to go to Harvard University and thinking that Massachusetts was the name of a tribe that has been pretty much exterminated. Nor does it take me very long walking around Boston and other cities to realize that there is something called race, which pretty much divides that country deep, deep, deep down. Nor am I unaware of the slave trade and other awful aspects of human history in the United States, Europe, and even my own country. But nothing of that has anything to do with what we're talking about right now, which is China in the 1950s and an awful regime that systematically curtailed every single freedom within the span of about 7-8 years, and reduced 80% of the population to bonded servants.
My concern was more your choice of metaphors to describe present China rather than to address the other metaphors that are just as valid, but we never include them because America is a paradigm of democracy. That was more my concern.
So this gentleman is not
I
comfortable.
think you sound very American that you wish to bring everything back to America.
So let's forget Hitler. Let's forget Hitler and Stalin. What about putting Mao in the same league? So forget Hitler and Stalin, which could be prejudiced. And what about Mao and Pol Pot? Surely they belong to the same league.
Stalin,
Pol Pot claimed himself to be the best student, pupil of Chairman Mao.
The comparisons impose themselves because these systems come from a particular place. Hitler learns from Stalin. Stalin learns from Hitler a little bit. Most of all, Mao learns from Stalin. Pol Pot learns from Mao. And I'm not meaning reading through a textbook. There are plane loads of Soviet advisors who arrive in 1949. In the Ministry of Education alone, there are about 120 Soviet advisors who tell the regime how to run the place. These are deeply organic links there.
And how to run the country,
And how
the
to run the
party
country,
as well.
how to
In
run
the
a public security
1920s and
bureau.
30s, Mao's party was closely monitored and supervised
Indeed.
by at least 1 or 2 representatives,
Indeed.
handpicked and sent to China by
absolutely.
Stalin.
In fact, to isolate the history of the People's Republic from the history of other one-party states is a serious mistake. To think that somehow Soviet Union is one thing, People's Republic is another one, I think is a very serious mistake. You can't understand it without knowing Russian and knowing the history of the Soviet Union. Having said that, I would want to make one comment. I used to think for quite some time that Mao was on a par with Stalin, Pol Pot, and others. But I've come to the conclusion that he really did blunder an awful lot. Not that Stalin did blunder, executing all his generals just before the Nazi invasion, and then when the Nazis invaded, hiding in his bunker was not a very smart move. But Mao did blunder in particular, obviously during the Great Leap Forward, but most of all during the Cultural Revolution. We have this image of Mao as the strong man, but ultimately Mao relied on Lin Biao to a much greater extent than Stalin ever had to rely on anybody, So I do slightly inflect my image of Mao there. One last question, maybe?
Thank you very much for your lecture and this interaction. I just got a question about your method of research, if you can say that. That I think many historians on modern Chinese history will have to deal with how they should evaluate weight or role of Mao in every decision-making process, especially when you come to his personality. That to what extent you can explain something by analyzing him, the single person, that how much he counted in the whole decision-making. Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. Thank you.
I think it's a really good question. I set out to try to reclaim the lives of ordinary people because so much has been written already about Mao and elite politics. So my question when I set out to do all my research was, where are the people in the People's Republic? Where's the history of ordinary people? That's very difficult to find. But having said that, I think it must be clear that Mao, although he's the architect of this system, is never alone. He always gets support at key moments from key leaders. And then, of course, below that level, there are many willing executioners, underlings on the ground, local cadres. And even further than that, I think it's also fair to say that to this day, many ordinary people do think that the man himself at the very top was a great man. It goes back to this idea which he already had under the empire, that the emperor is benign. His local representatives are really evil. The idea that somehow the emperor, while he's distant, simply doesn't know what is happening here. So paradoxically, at the very height of the famine, you find many villagers who write letters to the chairman asking him for help. So I think it's a very complex image, which I haven't unraveled, but I hope I will have contributed to it, to showing Mao in a much broader context.
Shall we take one final question? Yes.
Professor Dikötter, I also read your last book, and it gives me the impression that although the CCP claims to be a party for the peasants, a party of the peasants, and a party by the peasants, the main focus has been cities. I mean, when there are crises, people in the countryside suffered the most, while people in the cities, they got everything they wanted, they got everything they needed.
That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true from the very beginning, where villagers, I prefer the term villagers to peasants, are cannon fodder, and then are, of course, become bonded servants, I explained earlier on, by roughly 1956 onwards, is producing grain in order to feed the cities. And this is very clear during Mao's great famine from 58 to 62. And of course, the household registration system I mentioned, the hukou system introduced by Zhou Enlai in 1955, runs to this day and creates a two-class or two-caste country in which those classified as peasants, quote unquote, are legally, socially marginalized and inferior to those classified in their hukou as city dwellers. But ultimately, the party is not there for the villages or for the cities. The party is there for the party.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank. Thank you for your having gone through so many dead bodies and blood and order of skeletons, you know, out of all these unpleasant archives. I remember when I read The Reign of Terror of the French Revolution. It took me a few more months to listen to Haydn and Mozart, you know, to cleanse my mind of that depression, right? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.